Daf Lamed Vav 36 in Pesachim, and we were going to begin at the bottom of Lamed Hey Amid Beis 35b. The Mishnah had listed various grains that you can fulfill the mitzvah of matzah with, and various halachas that pertain to those grains that you can fulfill the mitzvah of matzah with, such as that a kohen can use teruma, and if you have maaser sheni, the second tithe that you had redeemed properly, that you're allowed to fulfill the mitzvah of such matzah. And then the Mishnah also listed some that you cannot use for matzah Pesach night, such as maaser sheni, the second tithe that you did not redeem properly, or that you did not redeem, the Mishnah says, or hektish that you did not redeem. And so the Gemara now challenges, if you did not redeem it, obviously you're not allowed to eat it. If you're not allowed to eat it, for sure you cannot use it for your mitzvah. You can't fulfill the mitzvah if you're not allowed to eat the matzah. And so we're going to begin 5 lines from the bottom of the narrow lines on Lamed Hey Amid Beis 35b, about 5 lines from the bottom of the narrow lines. And you also cannot use matzah from the maaser sheni, the second time, which is supposed to be eaten in Yerushalayim, and you have to redeem it to eat it outside of Yerushalayim and use the money in Yerushalayim, or hektish, something donated to the Beis Hamikdash, shelo niftu, that had not been redeemed. So the Gemara says pshita. This seems obvious. If you're not allowed to eat it, for sure you can't fulfill the mitzvah of matzah with it. La'olam the niftu. So it must be that you did indeed redeem it, or at least try to. So why does the Mishnah call it that it had not been redeemed? Because you didn't do it as appropriate as the halacha is, such as that you use an asimon in order to redeem it. And what is this asimon? So there are different interpretations of asimon, but basically Rashi learns here that it's a non-minted coin. It's a blank coin, especially in the times where the face of the coin had to change all the time because the ruler changed all the time, and so they'd have unminted coins. They were the proper weight, but they didn't actually have a face to it and a number to it. So an unminted coin is not sufficient. Because the Torah says you shall bind you take the coins in a bundle and bring it in. Now, why do I have to take it in a bundle? Maybe it's a single coin. So it should just say that you would take the coins with you. Why say v'tzarta? So that tells us also that it has to have an image, meaning it has to be a proper coin and not just a piece of silver. And therefore, since you used a non-minted coin, the second tithe, maaser sheni, would not be nifta, redeemed on such a coin. It doesn't work. So you attempted to, but it didn't work. And the Mishnah is telling us that even though you attempted to redeem it, since it didn't have the halachic status of a redemption, it's still maaser sheni, prohibited to you, and you're not allowed to eat it, and you can't fulfill the mitzvah of matzah with such produce. The hektish. And what is going to be the attempt, but unsuccessful attempt of redeeming hektish? Shechila agabi karka. You try to use real property to redeem it or to release it. Because the Torah says you will give the money and then it'll be yours. You can keep it, and obviously you cannot give real property. It's a non-movable, and so he trying to transfer the hektish onto real property does not work. This is the last of the narrow lines on 35b, Lamed Hey Amid Beis, and the Gemara now begins with a brisa. Perhaps you'd think that tevel, produce that had not been tithed or teruma had not been taken, that perhaps such produce is also permissible to be used to make your matzah for Pesach. So the Gemara says, what do you mean tevel shelo nitkan? That's the definition of tevel. Tevel is that you hadn't taken the appropriate teruma and maaser from it. That is the definition of tevel. So what do you mean shelo nitkan, that had not been fixed, had not been properly done? So kol tevel nami ole nitkan. Rather, what it means is that you did take some of it, but you didn't take all of it. You didn't take it properly. The first truma, which is called truma gedola, approximately 2%, that's given to the kohen, was taken. And then the tithe was given. The first maaser, which goes to the Levi, was also taken, but the Levi didn't take his 10% to the kohen. As we talked about yesterday, that the process is you take 2%. The farmer would take 2% from the entire thing to give to as teruma gadola, the great teruma, to the kohen. Then 10% to the Levi, and the Levi will take of this gift of 10% that he gets, 10% of that back to it would also go to a kohen, and that was not taken. Or maser rishon, v'le maser sheni. Or the first tithe was taken, the 10% that goes to the Levi, but the maser sheni, which the owner himself would then take to Yerushalayim and eat Yerushalayim, or transfer onto coins, and then bring the coins to Yerushalayim and buy food there. He didn't take the maser sheni. And even if he had taken the first tithe, but in the third and sixth year of the Shemitah cycle, instead of taking the second tithe for himself and take it to eat in Yerushalayim, or transfer onto coin to eat in Yerushalayim, that you would take a maser ani, a tithe that would go to the poor, and that one has no kedusha whatsoever. Whereas the teruma is elevated to the degree that only a kohen can eat it, and it has laws of tumah, and maser sheni, maser rishon has certain a gift to the Levi, and maser sheni can only be eaten in Yerushalayim. Maser ani really has no specific halachas other than you have to give it to the poor. And nevertheless, if you didn't take maser sheni or maser ani, it's going to count as you didn't properly fix it, and you cannot use this for matzah. Minayin, Talmud Lema. So we learn this from this teaching. It says, don't eat chametz, eat matzah. That means that the only prohibition that's allowed for this particular produce is that it's going to be, if it would be chametz. But if it had another prohibition besides for that, then it's not going to be chametz, so it's not going to be matzah. Anything that is prohibited on account of that being chametz. This is only prohibited as tevel, and meaning that the produce had not been properly separated and tithed. But it also has it has that prohibition, so it doesn't have the prohibition of matzah, of chametz, and therefore you can't fulfill the mitzvah of matzah. So Gemara says, why does it not have a prohibition of chametz? It has a prohibition of untithed produce, fine, but it also has a prohibition of chametz if you left it to become chametz, and therefore it should also have the mitzvah of matzah if you use it for matzah. Amar Rav Sheshes Amani Rav Shimon. So Rav Sheshes teaches us, says that, you know what, this is according to Rabbi Shimon, who says as a general rule, there's a concept, the Amar, ein iser halal iser. If you already have a prohibition on something, a second prohibition cannot take effect, unless there are exceptions of iser kollel, iser mosef, if there is an additional prohibition that is added to it, or it's a more generalized prohibition. We'll see plenty of those. But in the meantime, over here, where the prohibition of chametz is going to come after it's already prohibited because it's not tithed properly. So this produce is tevel, untithed, and you're not allowed to eat it. If it later becomes chametz, it's not going to become prohibited as chametz because it already has another prohibition. And therefore, if it's not prohibited as chametz, you can't use it as matzah. The Tanya. And where did Rabbi Shimon say this idea that ein is a halal iser? Rabbi Shimon says, and now we go to Lamed Vav at Aleph 36a at the top. Somebody eats on Yom Kippur, but what he eats was prohibited already prior to Yom Kippur. It was nevela. It was non-kosher meat. Putter. He's going to be exempt from bringing a chatas offering for the Korah's prohibition of eating on Yom Kippur, because it was the prohibition of Yom Kippur never took effect on this food, because the food is already prohibited before Yom Kippur came. However, Ravina says we don't have to say it's specifically, this halacha is specifically according to Rabbi Shimon. Ravina Amar Afilo Temer Rabbanan. We can even say this according to the Rabbanan. Misha Isura Mishamaltecha Chametz. The prohibition of chametz is what has to be the prohibition. It can't have an additional prohibition. Not that the prohibition of chametz did not take effect on account of that it is already prohibited because it's tevel, it's untied produce. Even if it's both prohibited as tevel and as chametz, then it's not going to be fulfilled as you can't fulfill the mitzvah matzah with it. Because he says that it has to be only the prohibition of chametz. This is prohibited not only as chametz but also as tevel, and therefore you would not fulfill the mitzvah of matzah with it because it isn't prohibited only on account of chametz. However, Rav Sheshes disagrees with Ravina and says midi bilvad ksiv. Does it say its prohibition is only chametz? It says it has a prohibition of chametz. So if the prohibition of chametz takes effect, because you say it's in Isser Chalalisa, that this prohibition can take effect on the prohibition of an untied produce of tevel, well then you have a prohibition of chametz, so you should be able to use it for matzah. And therefore, we're going to go back Ela Machvarta to the Rav Sheshes. It's better to say the opinion, the teaching of Rav Sheshes that this brisa concurs with Rabbi Shimon that ain't Isser Chalal Isser. And since the prohibition cannot take effect, the prohibition of chametz cannot take effect on account of that it's already prohibited as tevel. Therefore, you can't use it for matzah because it has to be matzah that, if it were to become chametz, would be prohibited as chametz.
Got a question?
Yeah.
When we talk about demai, is demai like in some way safek tevel, or is it's not tevel because demai is an assumption that they took out something because
they for sure took teruma.
We for sure took truma, or we assume they took truma.
Well, nothing's for sure, right? We have a chazaka that they would take teruma because people were careful with teruma. Meiser they were less careful with, but there was still enough people that did it that you could rely on it. But there was enough of a concern that some people don't do it that the Chachamim enacted and said, teruma meiser may not have been taken. Don't eat it unless you take meiser.
So demai, if we knew for sure that this Amaretz didn't take meiser, would that be tevel?
That's not demai. That's tevel.
Okay. So it's like it is a suffix.
Demai is you could say it's even less than a suffix.
What I'm saying is we made matzah out of demai and it's okay. So it's really, it's like borderline, right? They made it. They're saying
I don't know what you mean borderline.
They're saying tevel
Chazal made an isser. Chazal made an isser, a prohibition of eating produce that you buy in the marketplace when you're not sure that meiser was taken from it. That's the mai, and they call that the mai. The level of doubt is not as strong as a 50-50. It's not like, well, it's 50% take or don't, or I'm really not sure. There's a chance that there's a good chance the meiser was taken, and that's why poor people can eat from it, and you can give it to your guest. However, for yourself, Chazal said, if you're buying this for yourself, you should take truma. You should take meiser.
But if you knew for a fact that it's tevel, then it's not going to count for matzah.
Anytime you know something is prohibited, it's prohibited.
It's not going to count for matzah, is what I'm saying.
Anytime you know something's prohibited, you can't eat it as matzah for sure. It's prohibited. Can't eat it. The demai it's an enactment. You're buying from the marketplace and you don't know meiser was taken, take meiser, because some people don't. Okay. Tana Rabbanan. Perhaps a person can use meiser sheni in Yerushalayim and eat that, make matzah from that. So a person has grains, they tithe their produce. They first gave the Kohen his 2%. They gave the Levi his 10%. The Levi gave the Kohen his the 10% from that. And then he takes 10% and he brings it up to Yerushalayim to eat. And this is the 10% that he's supposed to eat in Yerushalayim, Meiser Sheni. It's proper. He's allowed to eat it. So you'd think he's allowed. So he could fulfill the mitzvah with it. This first opinion says no, he cannot. And why not? Talmud Lemer lechem oini. The Torah says this is a poor man's bread. This has to be bread of affliction. Masha nechal ba'aninus. There's another drash that he's saying here is lechem oni with an aleph, bread that is allowed to be eaten when someone's in mourning. But the second tithe, the Meiser Sheni, when he eats in Yerushalayim, he has to, at the end of the period of Meiser, he has to make a statement and say, "Achalti ba'oni mimenu." I did not eat of it while in sadness, while in mourning. And this is a mitzvah of the thanksgiving to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that you have produce and you had a great season, and that you can sustain yourself. And so you're bringing the 10% up and you're eating it in Yerushalayim, Lufnei Hashem, with the consciousness of Hashem in the sight of the Beis HaMikdash in front of you. So you're eating this in Yerushalayim. You have to eat it b'simcha, with joy. And you have to make a proclamation, a statement, I did not eat from it in sadness. And this bread specifically of matzah is lechem, bread that has to be able to be eaten as affliction bread. So you cannot eat matzah on the first night of Pesach and fulfill the mitzvah of lechem oni with bread that you're not allowed to eat, ba'oni. And now, even though one is poor man's bread, which is with an ayin, or poor bread because it only has bread and flour and water, which is with an ayin, poor bread, and the word oni with aninus or sadness or mourning is with an aleph, but they're interchangeable and they mean a related thing. And so Divrei Rabbi Yossi Galili, that's Rabbi Yossi Galili's opinion. You cannot use Maaser Sheni, which is required to be eaten b'simcha. You cannot use that for matzah, which is by definition lechem oni, poor man's bread, bread of affliction, which he says does require a level of sadness. Rabbi Akiva says matzah is riba. No, the Torah says multiple times matzah to tell you that this is included. You can even eat matzah from Maaser Sheni. You brought your 10% to Yerushalayim, your matzah to Yerushalayim. You eat it in Yerushalayim b'simcha, and you can eat it at the Seder night and make matzah out of these grains. So what does he learn from the fact that the Torah calls it lechem oni? Like we saw yesterday, it excludes bread that is wealthy bread, rich bread, because it's made with wine, with fruit juice, with honey, with oil. It's egg matzah, it's sweet matzah. It's not matzah that's pure, just flour and water. It has to be flour and water. That's what Rabbi Akiva learns. My time at the Rabbi Akiva. So what's the reasoning that Rabbi Akiva does not include the exemption or the exception of Maaser Sheni as matzah? Miksiv lechem oni. Does it say with a vav? Oni ksiv. It says a poor man's bread. It says ani. It's spelled with an ayin nun yud without the vav, which tells me poor man. Rabbi Yossi Galili mikarina oni. Do we call it ani, poor man? Oni ksiv. We karina. We read it with a cholam on the top of the ayin. Oni, which can mean also in mourning. Rabbi Akiva haida karina and be oni, and Rabbi Akiva says this is what we say. Oni has a different connotation. Kiddush Shmuel. That's the teaching that Shmuel taught us. The Amar Shmuel said lechem oni, that it's called the bread of the oni is to tell us lechem shoinen ola dvarim harbi, that you have to say over this bread, you have to say Hallel, and you say the Haggadah. It's bread that you, or matzah, right? Bread that you have mitzvahs to say over it, meaning that you don't just eat the bread and go. It is a part of the rest of it. You, in order to fulfill the mitzvah of matzah on the first night of Pesach, you have to also do the other mitzvahs, which is telling the story, the Sipur Yitzias Mitzrayim, the Haggadah, as well as saying Hallel. and so that it's a part of the larger mitzvah. You can't fulfill the mitzvah if you're not also going to say at that night that you're eating the matzah, also say Hallel and Haggadah. Now the Gemara is going to challenge and say, can you really not fulfill the mitzvah of matzah with egg matzah, with oil, with matzah that was made with oil, wine, or nectar? You can't fulfill the mitzvah. But Tani, we learned, Ein lashon isa b'Pesach b'yayin v'shemen advash. On Pesach, you should not make a dough with wine, oil, and honey. Even though earlier we learned that mei peres machmitzin, that fruit juices will not cause fermentation, and it doesn't cause chametz. However, you're not allowed to do this because it could become chametz. This first opinion says, and you can't guard it well. Either this disagrees with the previous opinion of mei peres machmitzin, or it means that it's not going to be. It will become chametz. It just won't become chametz of a kares level because it just doesn't make a good dough, and it's going to be something called chametz noksha. Chametz noksha is a chametz that is hard. It's like dry pasta as a chametz noksha. It's not really edible. It's not good, but it does become chametz. There is leavening that happens in that dough. Now, the imlash, if you did need dough with oil or a dough with fruit juice or wine, so Rabbi Gamliel says you have to burn it right away because it would have become chametz. It's nearly impossible to guard from becoming chametz. The Chachamim say no, you're allowed to eat it, and you're allowed to eat it because you can guard it and it will not become chametz. And for sure, once it's baked, it will not become chametz. Rabbi Kiva says, Shabbasi Haisa Eitzor Rabbi Eliezer Rabbi Yeshua. I once made my Shabbos, meaning I at the onset of Yantiv, I was at Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua. And I made for them a matzah in a dough that had exclusively wine, honey, or oil, and they didn't say stop. Hey, you're making chametz. They were okay with it. And now the Brisa continues. It says, and even though that we said you shouldn't make a dough like this, mekatfin. Once you made the dough, you can smear the outside of it with wine or oil, etc. In any case, asal latana kama. So that would be according to the opinion of the first opinion that you're not allowed to even knead it, and that he says you are allowed to smear it. And the Chachamim say whatever you're allowed to knead it with, you're also allowed to smear on the outside. When you're not allowed to knead with, you're not allowed to smear on the outside. But in any case, the Chachamim say you're allowed to knead it with wine and oil. And both agree. Rabbi Gamliel and the Chachamim, they all agree that you're not allowed to use warm water for the dough. So in any case, this is the end of the brisa. But what we see is Rabbi Kiva says clearly that he made a dough for the Chachamim, for Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Yeshua, out of wine, oil, and nectar and honey, and nobody said anything. So you see, Rabbi Kiva says that you may make matzah with these, and yet earlier we said that Rabbi Kiva learns that lechem oini means that the matzah has to be just water and flour and nothing else. That's what poor man's bread means. Like kashi, I'll be yantav rishon, I'll be yantav sheni. It says no, there's a distinction. If you're making it on the first night where there's a mitzvah to eat matzah, you have to eat matzah. So that has to be lechem oini. It has to be poor man's bread. The rest of yantiv, there is no mitzvah of eating matzah. You're just not allowed to eat chametz. There is, as we'll see more throughout the Masechta, there is a mitzvah that if you eat matzah, many say that you would fulfill the mitzvah of matzah. But you don't have to eat matzah the rest of the time. And so the first night where you have to eat matzah, so you have to have matzah that is bread and water, flour and water and nothing else. But the rest of Yantiv, you can make a cake. And you can eat cake. And so essentially that's what Rabbi Kiva made for them. And he said it's saying that it wouldn't become chametz, and not like Rabbi Gamliel, who said that it becomes chametz. But as far as the mitzvah of matzah, you wouldn't fulfill the mitzvah of matzah. Kedamalu Rabbi Yeshua Lebnei, like Rabbi Shua Levi said to his son, Yoma Kamaloi Telushali Bechalba. On the first night, don't make the matzah with milk in it. But from here on, you can eat you can make matzah with milk in it. Now, I don't know what he had on his menu for the Seder, but you shouldn't have your matzah in milk in any case because you have meat at the Seder. So that's a side question, right? What was he eating for the Seder, and did he have milchik matzah at the beginning of the meal and then have a meat at the in the meal itself? Be that as it may, he said for the night and for the Seder night, in any case, don't make it with milk because it has to be lechem ani, poor man's bread. But for the rest of the Yom Tov, you can make milchik matzah. So Gemara says, wait, but we just learned a few days ago, Vatanya ein lashon isa b'chalav. You're not allowed to make milchik or meat bread, because if you do so, what's going to end up happening is that you're going to eat the bread with either the meat bread that has fats in it with cheese on it, or you're going to eat the milchik bread, the matzah, with some meat. The imlash kala pasasura. And if you do make such a bread, the bread is considered non-kosher. Why? Because it's so common to eat bread with meat or with milk. So your bread always has to be parv. So this is what he must have said. Don't use nectar or honey in the bread in the matzah the first night. But the rest of Yom Tov you can use honey. Or if you want, you could say that really, as we read it first, that he told his son, you can't make a milchik bread for me. You can't put milk in it the first day, but you can put milk in the second day, and so on. Even though, as we learned, you cannot make bread with milk in it because of the concern that you're going to end up eating it with meat. And Kedama Ravina, like Ravina said, ke'imtura shari. If you make a small amount that's just for one meal, and that meal's a dairy meal, so then you can make dairy bread. Or if you make a larger amount, but you make them shaped differently, then also it's going to be permissible because that's the dairy bread. And I mentioned when we learned this last week that that's why in Israel the dairy barekas are triangular and the parv barekas are rectangular, because this is same idea that you shouldn't mix them up and serve them at the wrong meal. So hachanami ke'intura. So when Rabbi Shua Levi told his son, you can make for me dairy bread, matzah, on the other days of Yom Tov, I was talking about matzah that would be either a small amount, just enough for that one dairy meal, or he made it a milchik bread, but it was made in a shape that you can tell this is going to be a different shape, a dairy bread shape, and so you would not come to eat meat with it. So Gemara said, the Brisa said, everybody agrees you can't use warm water, lukewarm water for your matzah. You have to use cold water because lukewarm water would hasten the process of becoming chametz. So ma'ishna menachas. Why is this any different than a mincha, which we know almost all the menachas have to come as matzah? They're not allowed to be chametz. No chametz is allowed on the mizbeach. There are a few menachas, such as the 10 bread, we mentioned the 10 of the 40 breads for a toda, which were chametz. But generally, a mincha had to be a matzah. And the Tanan, we learned in menachas, this halacha, that kol ha-menachas niloshim b'paishrin. All mincha doughs were mixed with lukewarm water. And however, you had to be careful. Umeshamron shelo yachamtzu. They would carefully guard them not to become chametz, meaning they would continue working them so they don't become chametz. So why is it that matzah, you tell me, everybody agrees you cannot use it for chametz? You cannot use lukewarm water, and for mincha you may use lukewarm water. So Gemara says, how can you compare that? In Amru reason. If we say it by the Beis Hamikdash with diligent kohanim that are careful to make sure that everything is done right, Yomru b'shein's reason, you want to say this for everybody in their home where people are not necessarily as careful. as a general rule for the populace, you have to make a rule and say only use cold water. In the Beis Hamikdash, where you have people that are diligent and carefully doing the malacha, that what's supposed to be done, of course, it should be done with better water, which is going to be lukewarm. Ihachi miltus nami lasis. Well, if that's the case, they should also be allowed to take the grains and soak it in water to get the husk and bran off. Alama, why did we learn? Amar Rabbi Zera. Why did Rabbi Zera say Amar Rabbi Yirmiyah Barabba Mashmul in the name of Shmuel? Chitin shamanachos ein loisen so that the wheat kernels of minchas, you can't put them into water in order to get the to get the husk off. Why shouldn't you do that? These kahanim, they're very careful. The Gemara says no. Lisha bezrizin, the kneading of the dough is done in the courtyard of the Beis Hamikdash. It's done with kahanim, so therefore they are careful. Isa said you can use water. Lasisa leisa bezrizin, but the dehusking is not necessarily done by the kahanim. That can be done out in the marketplace, or out somewhere else, and therefore that's not necessarily done by zrizim, people who are diligent, and it's not allowed to be done. V'lisha me'isa b'zrizim. Well, does the kneading of the dough have to be done by kahanim that are diligent? But it says in the Torah that the pouring of the oil should be done by a kohen, meaning and bring it to the kohen. Tells us that it's after the pouring of the oil. That's when the kohen puts his hand in and it takes a kamitza, the fistful. That's the part the kohen has to start with. But the rest of it, limed al yitziko, belilo, the pouring of the oil and the mixing, sheksheru b'chaladim, that anybody can do that. Lisha nehida bezrizin lesa. You're right that the kneading itself did not have to be done by the kohen. Someone else, that the person who brought the korban or someone else could do it. But however, it's done in the courtyard of the Beis Hamikdash. B'makom zrizin isa. And so the diligent kahanim, even if they're not kneading it themselves, would make sure that whoever is doing it, so come on, keep it from becoming chametz. Let's move, and would make sure that it's done correctly. The Amar Mar, Belilak Shera Bazar, as the teacher taught, that mixing the dough is permissible by a non-kohen. Chutz l'chemes hazara psula, but if it's done outside of the courtyard, it's going to be invalid. That tells us it's done in the makom zrizin, it's done in the courtyard where the kahanim are there. However, lafuke lasisa, but the soaking of the wheat berries in order to remove the husk, the enab is reason, v'lebemakam is reason. It's not a kohen that does it, and it's not in the Beis Hamikdash in the Azara where a kohen is there to care and make sure it's done right. So Gemara says, okay, what about minchas omer? What the mincha of the omer was brought by the community on the second day of Pesach to allow to the barley offering. In order to begin the harvest and the new grain for the new year. So the Tana we learned that they would soak it in water to get the husk off, and they would bring it together. So why over there was they were allowed to do this, soak it and then drain it by putting it together and draining the wheat. Tzibor shani. Well, that's a community. So when a community is doing it together, everybody's careful to make sure that they're doing it right. When an individual is doing it in their home, yes, some people will be diligent, but some will not, and therefore it's best to not use lukewarm water.
The omer is not. The omer wasn't dry yet. So what would be the? I mean,
so it
wasn't
dry yet.
We know that it was what do you call it? It was still chewy. It hadn't dried out.
They but once
from the field.
Yeah, but once you take it, once you cut it off from it, and you start dehusking it, the water can get into it and it can start fermenting.
I would have never thought of that, because I mean I always imagined that the omer was pretty much
still green.
They had
to
dry it. They had to dry it out in drums. They have to dry it out to make the flour. They have to dry it.
But there could be chametz there, right? It could turn into chametz. Some of it could have cracks already. Some kernels could be, and you're soaking it in water, so it could get in and it could start becoming fermented. As we saw earlier, that even in the wheat berry itself could become fermented. So perhaps a person can use bikurim which is the mitzvah of bringing the first produce up to Yerushalayim as a thanksgiving. Perhaps you can use bikurim as your mitzvah of matzah. Therefore, it says, in all your dwelling place, you should eat matzah. Matzah that you can eat anywhere. You can eat it in Yerushalayim, and you can eat it at home. But bikurim can only be eaten in Yerushalayim. It cannot be eaten anywhere else, and so you cannot fulfill the mitzvah with it. Divrei Rabbi Yossi Aglili. That's Rabbi Yossi Aglili's opinion. So we saw earlier that the Maser Sheni, the second tithe, Rabbi Yossi Aglili also said you cannot use for matzah because you have to eat it. Matzah has to, the lechem, the Maser Sheni has to be eaten b'simcha, and this is called lechem oni. Here he says for bikurim that it has to be eaten in Yerushalayim, and the mitzvah of matzah is b'chol mashva seichem. You have to be able to eat it anywhere in your home. Rabbi Akiva ima matzah morer. Rabbi Akiva says, well, I'm going to compare matzah and morer. Ma morer ein sheina bikurim. Just as morer is not something that you could even bring bikurim from. It's a bitter herb. Af matzah she'ena bikurim. So matzah also, which technically you could bring as bikurim, but it'd have to be similar matzah and morer. So you wouldn't eat bikurim as your matzah. Well, if you're comparing the two, maybe just as mar is not within the kind that could even have bikurim, so too matzah would have to come from something that there isn't even the mitzvah of bikurim about. And now we go to Lamed Vav and Beis, and says, and if that's the case, otzi chitin usa'orin, and then I would exclude wheat and barley, sheyesh b'mina bikurim, because within that there is a mitzvah of bikurim, of the first fruit. Matzahs riba. Therefore, Rabbi Akiva says that matzah is multiple times to tell you that it's inclusive. And he said earlier it includes the second tithe, matzah sheni. And here he says it includes also wheat and barley. Matzahs riba fil bikurim. Well, perhaps it also should include bikurim, just like it included matzah sheni. So the Gemara says you're right. Indeed, Hadabe Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva did retract this idea. The Tani we learned, perhaps a person can fulfill the mitzvah of matzah with bikurim. To that it says, no, you cannot use bikurim because it says, in all of your dwelling places eat matzah, and that's going to exclude something that can only be in Yerushalayim and not outside of Yerushalayim, and not in your own home. Matzah hanachel is b'chol moshavos. Matzah that can be eaten in any dwelling. Yatsa bikurim she'en nechol b'chol moshavos. And bikurim is not such a thing because it cannot be eaten in all your dwelling places. It can only be eaten in Yerushalayim, Eli b'Yerushalayim. Yochel sheni moitzi af ma'aser sheni. Well, then use this also and exclude ma'aser sheni, the second tithe, which also has to only be eaten in Yerushalayim. And Rabbi Akiva earlier said that you could fulfill the mitzvah with that. Talmud leimar matzahs riba. So for that, we have multiple times the Torah said matzah to tell you that matzah sheni is included. Umarais. And why is it that you're including one and not the other? Both of them, the mitzvah is to eating Yerushalayim. Bikurim you have to take to Yerushalayim and eat. Matzah sheni you have to take to Yerushalayim and eat. Why did Rabbi Akiva see that you should exclude bikurim but include matzah? Marais. What did you see? L'rabis matzah sheni loitza bikurim. So the Gemara, he answers, Mar ba'ani ma'aser sheni sheyesh leheta b'chol moshavos. There is a way to eat ma'aser sheni wherever you are, because you're allowed to redeem it and eat it at home. And even if you already brought it to Yerushalayim, if it had become tamei, you can redeem it and take it back home and eat it. So ma'aser sheni can be eaten anywhere. Could Rabbi Lazar, like Rabbi Lazar said, bikurim, and I would exclude bikurim the einla heta b'chol moshavos, and bikurim, you can only eat it in Yerushalayim, and there is no way to eat it anywhere else. So if the teaching in the Torah is b'chol moshavos matzahs, in all of your dwelling places eat matzah, even a second tithe with the ma'aser sheni, where the mitzvah is to take it to Yerushalayim to eat. There are ways to eat it elsewhere, either before you brought it to Yerushalayim to redeem it, or after you brought it to Yerushalayim. If it became tamei, you can redeem it and bring it home. So it is something that could be eaten at home. in any dwelling place, whereas the Bikurim, it's only in Yerushalayim and really only in Yerushalayim. What is the statement of Rabbi Lazar? Rabbi Lazar said, how do you know that the second tithe, Ma'aser Sheni, that had become tummy, even in Yerushalayim, you're reading it? Up until now, we were talking about the Kohen lives up in the north. He takes his grapes, he harvests his grapes, he's got a lot, he takes 10% as his Ma'aser Sheni after he took Truma, Ma'aser Rishon, etc. He now takes Ma'aser Sheni and he has to bring it up to Yerushalayim, but he's not going to bring it up right now. He's not ready to go. And there's more harvesting to do and more pressing to do of the wine. So he transfers it onto a coin. That's the general Ma'aser Sheni pidin, of redemption of Ma'aser Sheni onto a coin. Once he comes to Yerushalayim, he takes those coins and he transfers it onto food. He buys food with it. Now that must remain in Yerushalayim and he must eat it in the proper way. If it became tummy, he can even redeem that and bring it back to Yerushalayim, to his home and eat it. So therefore, any matzah, even in Yerushalayim, the matzah of Ma'aser Sheni really can be eaten at home as well in a certain way. Maybe not in the state that it is now, that it's tahor, and he's not going to intentionally make it tummy. But if it did become tummy, he can redeem it and bring it home. So it does apply to all moshavas, to all of your dwelling places. Whereas bikurim must remain in Yerushalayim. You're not allowed to eat it. That's the drash over here, that you may not eat it, meaning you're not allowed to eat it. And how do we know that the word se'es means eating? Because 2 weeks ago in the parsha, when Yosef gave all the brothers food and sent them home, he gave Binyamin extra. He gave him 5 times the amount. So they each got food. They carried a mases me'es panav. And so we see that it's food. And it means that Rabbi Lazar says that you're allowed to redeem the Ma'aser Sheni and bring it home if you're not allowed to eat it because it's tummy, so you can't. So you're allowed to eat it. In any case, what we see in this brisa, now Rabbi Kiva, it must be the opinion of Rabbi Kiva because it says Ma'aser Sheni may not. You may eat Ma'aser Sheni as matzah, the second tithe, on account of that you can bring it home, but you're not. And matzah's riba, the matzah is included. Even Ma'aser Sheni, but Bikurim is not. So you see, this is the opinion of Rabbi Akiva, and his source is the same source as Rabbi Gamliel. As Rabbi Yossi, on account of Bechol Moshvasechem Tochamatzes, because it says in all your dwelling places, and Bikurim cannot be eaten elsewhere. So you see that he retracted his comparison of matzah to maror and essentially accepted the interpretation of the drash of B'chol Moshe V'Sechem. Man Shabbos Le'Dama B'Ma'aser Sheni Napik Bei Rabbi Akiva. Whose opinion is it that the Ma'aser Sheni is valid and you can use for matzah? That's the opinion of Rabbi Akiva. And he learns the source that Bikurim are excluded and you can't use for matzah from the verse of B'chol Moshe V'Sechem Shema Mina Hadabei. So we see he retracted his first comparison of matzah and maror and learns it from the same place. Rabbi Yossi Aglili. Rabbi Yossi Aglili typically milechamani. Now, Rabbi Yossi Aglili said you're not allowed to eat the Ma'aser Sheni, the second tithe, because it has to be done by simcha, and matzah has to be lechamoni. And by bikurim, he also says that you can't eat it in matzah, but there he says a different thing. It's because you have to eat it in all your dwelling places, and matzah has to be eaten in every dwelling place, and bikurim can only be eaten in Yerushalayim. Why didn't you say the same teaching before? It's lechamoni. It has to be poor man's bread. Bikurim is besimcha. The Gemara says no. Like Rabbi Shimon, he holds like Rabbi Shimon that actually the second tithe, Ma'aser Sheni, you're not allowed to eat in morning, but bikurim may be eaten in morning. The Tanya, as we learn, bikurim asurim la'inid. Bikurim are prohibited to someone in morning. Rabbi Shimon matir. Rabbi Shimon says that you may eat in the morning. So what's the reason? My time in the Rabbanon. Why do Rabbanon say you can eat bikurim even in the morning? You may not eat it in morning because it says lesucha lecha b'sharecha. The Torah says that you may not eat in your own gates maser degancha, your tithe, v'tirosh v'tzarecha, bichores tzorcha, and the firstborn of your bakar and son, of your cattle and sheep, and all of your gifts, v'chol nadarecha v'nedosecha utrumas yodecha, and the teruma. Now, what teruma is it talking about over there that it says that you may not eat? V'amar terumas yodecha, the truma of your hands that you may not eat in your own gate, Elo bikurim. This is the halacha of bikurim, and it's juxtaposed and put into the same statement as maser. The iskers bikurim lamaser. Ma maser aser la'onein. Just as the maser was said, he's going to have to make a statement and say that I did not eat it in mourning. So too, af bikurim aser la'onein. Bikurim too may not be eaten to someone in mourning. Rabbi Shimon, Teruma Karena Berachmanaka Teruma. And Rabbi Shimon says, no, it's like Teruma. That's what the Torah called it, Teruma. Ma Teruma Muteras La'inin, Af Bikurim Muter La'inin. So too, it's going to be permissible. Bikurim also is permissible to Oinin. Tomorrow we'll continue with the machlokas of the Chachamim and Rabbi Shimon, whether or not Bikurim, the first fruit, may be eaten Yerushalayim by someone who is in mourning. Have a great